Okay, so my name is Joyce Raimondo. I'm the education coordinator at the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center in East Hampton. We're located about 100 miles east of New York City in the United States. We're a national landmark, the home and studio of Pollock and Krasner. And we have a special program today, The Art of Change. So can artists affect change beyond the boundaries of the act of painting or making sculpture or actually producing art? What other ways can artists also affect change? So we have a special guest today, Hope Sandrow, and she will be presenting her work today. But before we get to Hope, we have Helen Harrison, our director here, and she's going to tell us the ways that Lee Krasner used her intellect, her creativity, and even her fortune to promote positive change for the community. So welcome, Helen.
Hi. Yeah, we better get out of the light. That's a little bit right over there.
You can sit.
All right. Welcome, everyone, and I hope you'll take advantage of an in-person visit someday soon. We open for the season on May 5th. But in the meantime, Joyce is doing a wonderful job of bringing the house to the audience, and she's performing a very important public service. But I want to talk a little bit about Lee Krasner and what she did for her community, not only during her lifetime, but as her legacy. Now, she and Jackson both worked for the federal government during the Depression when there was a subsidy for artists called the Federal Art Project under a larger program that people know about called the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. And that was in force from 1935 through the beginning of 1943. And it really helped these artists to develop their creativity, to stay in their profession during a time when there was very, very heavy unemployment. We had over 25% unemployment back then, and they didn't have to worry about commercial pressure. They were able to do their work without having to sell it. Uncle Sam was buying it from them before they even did it. They got a weekly wage to do their work. So as you can imagine, this was a godsend for these people. And when Lee thought about what she wanted to do with her legacy, she had that in mind. She thought that the most important thing she could do to help artists would be to buy them time so that they could do their work without thinking about commercial pressure or about making a living from it, but just being able to concentrate on developing themselves as artists. So in her will, she made provision for a foundation that would give grants to what were defined as needy and worthy artists. So you are required to be in financial need and to have a professional art career. This foundation is headquartered in New York City. It's not affiliated with the Pollock-Krasner House, although they have been generous to us, but they give grants all over the world. They were started, Lee died in 1984, and her will set it up. It began operating in 1985. And since that time, it has given over $70 million in grants to artists in, I think it's 35 or 36 countries around the world. And sometimes it really is life-changing for some people. I had a close friend who applied for one, and I think it literally saved her life. It enabled her to get medication that she couldn't afford otherwise. It enabled her to pay rent that she couldn't afford otherwise. And it was just a life-changing experience for her. Also, the professional validation of having an agency like that say you are worthy, you are an artist, and you deserve support is also psychologically very, very important to many of the people who receive these grants. So Lee really wanted her fortune. When she died a wealthy woman, her estate was valued at over $21 million at the time of her death. And the foundation has since built on those assets. So it's worth more than twice that now, in spite of the fact that it gives away $1 million or so every year. But the intention was to help artists into the future, not just to support her posthumous reputation. So the Pollock-Krasner Foundation is the agency that carries out her wishes in that regard. And We have had so many artists come to visit us and tell us their stories about how the foundation has impacted them in a positive way. So I hope that some of you who are out there who are artists would consider applying. The application is all online, and you go to their website, which is pkf as in Frank.org, and all the instructions and information are there. So I will turn it back over to Joyce.
Thank you so much, Helen Harrison. And of course, Lee Krasner is responsible for, before her death, making sure that this site would become a museum and a study center. And at the end of our program today, if we have time, I will give you a walkthrough of the barn studio and the house and the property where Pollock and Krasner lived. We are run under the auspices of the Stony Brook University, and there's a huge piece of land that was also donated to the Nature Conservancy. So when we talk about community and positive action, this doesn't just, you know, we might take for granted having access to this site, for example, but this is because of vision. And this is because of human beings actively committing their time and their energy, and in some cases their money, to these causes. And we all know today more than ever we need this. I don't know, maybe not more than ever, but it sure seems like that. And I'm really grateful to be able to host these Zooms as part of our education program, where we do reach a worldwide audience, which in a sense is unifying people as well in a positive direction. So on that note, I am really happy today to introduce Hope Sandrow. Hope is an artist, an activist. She's considered, she calls herself a conceptual artist. She lives and works in Shinecock Hills, Southampton, which is on the east end of Long Island. And this Zoom is very timely because she has one of her major projects in an exhibition called Art for Change at the New York Historical Society in New York City. I was lucky to visit the exhibition. And my takeaway from the exhibit is that it makes visible some aspects of society that we normally turn away from. And Hope will tell you more about that. So let's welcome Hope Sandrow. Yeah, so would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself? And
yes,
go ahead.
well, first, I want to thank you and Helen, who I know personally, both of you, for your invitation for me to appear amongst a series of interviews of my colleagues. I also want to thank the many, many resident artists and colleagues whose participation in my project shaped it, including the New York Historical Society curators, Rebecca Clausen and Laura Mogilescu, for their exhibition idea, followed through with a very thoughtful, compelling installation supported by the New York Historical Society. And I want to thank all of you here this afternoon for tuning in. It's great to see many of you who I haven't seen in 2 years in person, but this is a nice substitute. You're seeing me seated in the stable room of my husband, artist and musician Ulf Skogsberg's, in my carriage gatehouse. It was designed by architect Rosner Atterbury in 1891, and it's one of 3 structures that compose the Jane B. Colt estate. Also, we also own another surviving structure, also a carriage gatehouse that I learned 2 years ago had been moved, was William Merritt Chase's. The architect was Stanford White. Chase's former home studio is a nearby landmark that I named my project for his practice. My current project, Open Air Studio, Shinecock Hills Space Time. Properties within the Shinnecock Indian Contact Period Village Fort Critical Environmental Area and Cultural Resources Protection Overlay District were inhabited by First Peoples 14,000 years ago, and similar to the peoples that settled Manhattan at that time. They traveled back and forth. Hearing the passing trains almost every hour, as when Jane B. Colt lived here, Chase founded the Shinecock Summer School of Art, which has influenced the journey of my on-site project, both personally and collectively, investigating the relevancy of art to life, as I did in Artisan Homeless Collaborative. I'll start I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Wait. I believe in artists, and I love this quote by Duchamp. It has a lot of meaning to me. Marcel Duchamp installed large glass at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where as a young girl, I found my place in life, engaged in the creative process. Drawings, paintings, and writings, a prism through which to live under the Holocaust shadow over a Camden Jewish ghetto amidst sibling deaths, molestation, and rape. Engaging with community, a practice taught by grandparents Morris and Pearl, such as the Tuberculosis Society, for whom I volunteered and was named Miss Cleaner Air, as I advocated for clean air. And community engagement, a family legacy passed down from great-great-grandparents, Rivley and Itzhak, living in Ukrainian shtetls. My young years were framed by an era of dissent, the adoption of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The decade concluded with high school graduation and passage of the Equal Rights Amendment when I was studying photography and film with classmate and since friend Deborah Wells at Philadelphia College of Art. Along with many other plans that were postponed was Rebecca and Laura's exhibit, Art for Change. Staying in place, in addition to collaborating with neighbors for preserving ancestral lands, I had the idea of sharing eggs with the Shinecock Food Pantry. In 2020, shared 1,800 eggs. In 2021, 3,300 eggs. And so far this year, since February 20th, 228 eggs. And here's the video. Hope Sandrow. My workday begins at sunrise on a wooded hillside where birdsong mixes with sound blowing in the winds. Now, during this mandated stay in place to halt virus COVID-19, it's solely those of essential workers. A pause. An unusual stream of cars and trucks planes overhead my Shinecock Hills neighborhood. Shown here of my chance encounter with a white cockerel in 2006, who crossed the road to follow me home. Named Shinecock for where we met, became my muse for this interactive series titled On the Road, exhibited to pay survives. During this pause of life, as usual, I wonder if the restart will focus on the health of our planet and natural resources. No more building exemptions given as here on the canal, despite 10 years of our public opposition. Will societal inequities be addressed as those suffered by neighbor Shinecock Nation? Well, I'm happy to share my hen's delicious eggs, which I've been photographing while canneling after discovering their resemblance to moons, planets, stars. Considering the micro and the macro, the relationship of art to life in my practice, and conversations with Southampton Art and Culture Committee members that I chair. As the threat of the pandemic loomed early this year, we pulled, shaped the roots of this invasive thorny vine smilax as a sculpture sited on a slope above the road. It's uncertain how we'll emerge from pause, unsure about the world on the other side, like the white cockerel Shinecock standing on the road, deciding which way to cross.
Hope
Sorry,
Sandrow.
wait. Okay. Other collaborative projects this century include The Fabric of Time and Space, Space-Time. It was a commission to travel Indonesia to create art for permanent installation at the U.S. Embassy, Jakarta, from Art and Embassies Chief Curator Virginia Shore and Curator Claire de Alba. And the fabrics were made by Manggarai tribes weavers. The photographs I took underwater nearby show the influence of their on their fabrics. The colors are all natural. This is a photograph from my series Observational Findings entitled Lay Bare. It reveals things unearthed in the ground by me and or the Shinecock flock members relating to the social, cultural, and natural history with an open air studio. The title references the influence of Marcel Duchamp on my art making, in which the role of chance is the central experience. This blue and white fragment of unknown origins was unearthed by a flock member September 3rd, 2021. And I'm showing it alongside a photograph of a Manggarai roundhouse from the village of Wairobe, Flores, where I visited for the art making. And I can't get over that I have a piece of pottery that was unearthed that resembles these roundhouses on the other side of the world. This was an installation at the New Parish Art Museum called Genus Loci. It was commissioned by Andrea Grover, inaugurated the Parish Art Museum's platform project. Collaborators included Sir Rodney Sir, Shinecock Elizabeth Hale, Montauk Observatory, Elke Luton and Kira Alka, Maureen Connor and the Institute of Wishful Thinking, Carlos Lama, and Ulf Skogsberg, my husband. Now we're returning to last century, and this is the first series of photographs that I made. It was titled Men on the Streets, where I flipped the role of women being gazed at or watched to my directing a man, and I would approach strangers and ask them to pose for my pictures. This is at Castle Clinton. And here's my friend Keith Herring, who we bravely went to One Police Plaza. And if you can recall, he was a graffiti artist and wanted by the police. Now I'll show a selection of artworks, both personal and collaborative, that I was engaged in at the same time as Artists and Homeless Collaborative, so you can see the relationship between the art that we made in the shelters and my own work. That was one of 4 in the series.
Oh, can you tell us a little bit about how these were made? Like, is that a picture of someone or is it a
These
fabric?
are photographs that I made, and then I submerged them in water and peeled the paper backing off of the silver prints. And then they were torn up and pinned back together to represent the feeling of alienation of being assaulted and raped. And then the third part was called Time, of Memory, Spaces, Time. And the idea was of being reunited through nature to being coming whole. And they were monoprints in the color blue. and which also reconnected to nature. And there was the idea of reconnecting the figure to the ground that was separated in the early images. At the same time, I showed those in the exhibition Water Life, curated by Eugenie Tsai at the Whitney, at Philip Morris. I'd also rescued these moon snail shells that had been thrown up on the beach, and I took out each body and oiled them and numbered them. That's why I know there's 9,998. And the spiral was really important to me because it shows the cycle of life. I was also commissioned by Vera List. You could see this theme of my taking the backing off of images. I was commissioned by Vera List to make this photograph, to make this piece called Flag of the 90s. And it was curated by Kathy Goncharoff, then New School curator. And there are 24, and many of our esteemed colleagues. I was very honored again to work with, including Kathy, Eugenie Tsai, Thelma Golden, Comer Malmud, Candida Alvarez, Patrick O'Connell, Ida Panicelli, Billy Zen, Lucy Lepard, Adele Maldonado, Maria Elena Gonzalez, Luis Bourgeois, Vito Conchi, Sir Rodney Sir, Martha Wilson, Maura Sheehan, Sam Revelis, Kay Walking Stick, Thomas Sokolowski, Fred Wilson, Paul Ha, and Rob Storr. I love Louise Bourgeois' work. It was great meeting her. Great experience meeting all these artists who came to my studio for their portrait. And then after that, I was commissioned by Creative Time and Pasternak to create a project. And here's a bird's eye view of it at the Anchorage for their project for Creative Times Art in the Anchorage. And that I invited my colleagues, Terry Atkins, Jane Dixon, Robin Kahn, Susan Leopold, Christian Marclay, Matthew McCaslin, Sarah Pasty and neighbors, Glenn Cedar, and John Yao to participate in. So the idea was to use the cardboard box, which was first produced in that area of the Anchorage, and to make artworks from it, using it, so that if when someone walked into the space, it looked like the warehouse it used to be, and then discovered the art. Here we come to Laura and Rebecca's exhibition, which has this quote, which I'll leave up while I tell you that I was asked to propose a project for which I was awarded. Oh, wait. Here it is. A question for each of us to consider, and without art, a nation perishes. I love Lanzetta's quote. I had created a newsletter at the shelter for the residents to submit articles and poems. And then I published it, and this quote was part of her essay that she wrote. First, I volunteered at the Catherine Street Family Shelter with Susan Lebowski Talbot, and I published the newsletter there, and resulted in my being barred from returning. I was then invited to volunteer at the Park Avenue Armory Shelter for Women, do anything I wanted, including the newsletter, and that's the subject of the exhibition. It took me 6 months of visiting with the residents to convince them and win their trust to join me in making art. Here's the exhibition sign. And then I was invited to propose a project for which I was awarded an NEA Special Projects Grant with NIFA fiscal sponsorship. It changed the whole atmosphere. When we got off the elevator, we would hear, the artists are here. That was different than all the other opposition we felt in society from the culture wars. Evenings at Park Avenue Armory included John Ahern, Rigoberto Torres, Ingrid Madera, Gretchen Langheld, Suzanne McNair, Charles Long, Oliver Herring, Peter Crashes, Philip Notre Dame, Michael Boudreau, Papana Sorio, Glenn Lejeune, Lisa Brown, and Kurt Belschel, B. Wirtz, Robert Kushner, Kiki Smith, Ida Opperbrook, Judah Shea, Frank Moore, Julia DeMaria, members of WAC, and the Guerrilla Girls. My idea for our arts education project in collaboration with Dina Halal of the Whitney Museum, and that continues at the Whitney now, 20 years, 30 years later. And Philip Yenuin of MoMA was awarded a Warhol Foundation grant. And we had talks about art that included Agnes Gund on public art, Thomas Sokolowski about Matisse, followed by Aggie hosting our visit to the MoMA Matisse exhibit. So the background to this and my colleagues was the loss of our colleagues to AIDS. And we all took different paths to follow. And mine was to go into the homeless shelter. And here are my portraits from men and back on the streets of Nicholas Moufarage, who died in 1985, Keith Haring, and Peter Hujar was my muse. And they are in the exhibition selected by the curators. Here's a photograph taken of the armory, and the inset is a picture of me working with the women on the project, What We Need and What We Wish in 1991. The photograph is by Thomas McGovern, the photograph of me. And in regards to AIDS, Frank Moore and I created the Ribbon Armory Project, where women in the shelter were paid to make red ribbons. And it was a great way for them to earn money and to feel respected. And when the ribbons were worn at the Oscar ceremony, it was incredible response. And here's more AIDS projects that we did. There's a self-represented poster that was composed of what the women participants wrote. Many of them had lost family members to AIDS by this time. And this is with the group Visual AIDS, which I was also a member of. So basically, wherever I went, and people that are watching know this, I told people about the project and convinced them to come at least once to the shelter and to see how they could utilize their art making and learn from the process. As you walk into the show, you'll see John Ahern and Rigoberto Torres's sculpture, Life Cast, titled Ernestine with Three Friends. And this is how the show came about. The pieces were donated to the New York Historic Society. And then they called me up and they said, what is Artists and Homeless Collaborative? These are two works that I created with others. One is called, on the left is called Three Views, and it's the perspective of a woman who found safety in the shelter named Geraldine Womack. Her portrait at the left is by Michael O'Neill. The Polaroids, you'll see they are stripped from the backing also. Then I made, Geraldine took the photograph and I stripped them and put them together. And then I wrote an article about homelessness, the kind that you would find in a newspaper article, in a newspaper. And then the piece on the right is Two Views with Edna Diaz. And again, she took the Polaroid pictures that I put together, my portrait of her crying because she was there suffering the loss of her son who was murdered. More colleagues. I was thrilled to collaborate with the Guerrilla Girls. they came to the shelter and had workshops with the women and made these posters on the right. And you'll see their work in the center. Do women have to be naked to get into the Met? And on the left are installation shots of Women's Action Coalition, which I was a member of. And they came to the shelter in response to my idea of creating a resume project. I thought, how do you ever get out of a shelter if you don't have a resume and people don't know your work experience? But now 30 years later, it's a great story about who these women were. A true story. Here's a close-up of the posters, and I apologize for they're not being in focus. I have to retake that picture.
Oh, Hope, what did you do with the posters? Like, where did they end up? I mean, when they were
In every
printed?
shelter, oh, all the posters, the visual aids and the Gorilla Girls, they were put in every single shelter. We paid for that, so that other shelters they were distributed into every city shelter and every public shelter. And some of them are we pasted on the street. This is a project that writer Michael Boudreau and I conducted with residents of the 69th Regiment Army, was the one on 25th Street where the original art fair was shown, where it's titled, What I Need and What I Want. I mean, basically the theme of all these artworks was to give the women a medium to represent themselves and to tell the public what they really needed, because how do you solve the issues and the problems without knowing what they are? And these, the Stark Society framed them, but these again are peeled. And the women were asked to make drawings of dresses of their dreams. And this is pastel on charcoal on paper. I'm not naming the women because they prefer anonymity, to maintain their privacy. But I have all the names. Another portrait series by Julia DeMario, who's a printmaker and artist, had the women make their drawings on cold plates and then hand colored the prints. Again, it's the idea of people seeing who the women were and not just dismissing them as the others or women on that don't have homes. This is a close-up of a print, a Xerox transfer on Nepal paper led by Kiki Smith. And these are all in the exhibition. And a project led by Judith Shea. The women were asked to make self-portraits. There are many more, and they were purchased, and the women received the money directly. So I don't have a list of where those pieces are, so we couldn't assemble them for the show. Other than I own the one on the left, and Oliver and Peter own the one on the right with the red dress, and Judith Shea purchased the one in the background. And there was a fire at the social club in the Bronx, and the shelter quickly put up in response a sheetrock wall to prevent any fires at the armory. And Ida Applebrooke thoughtfully asked the women to draw paintings of windows and what they'd like to see that was put up on the sheetrock. There's more of these paintings. The show only contains a selected amount of the works that were made. And here's just 3 of the paintings. And this was a piece called What I Wish. It involved hundreds of artists, both residents and our colleagues and women and children. And there's me 30 years ago, pictured in a video that my husband Ulf made that you can see in the exhibition. And I'm pictured with Peaches. We're celebrating a surprise party that they threw for me for my birthday to thank me for the project. You can see the video in the exhibition. I love the picture because it really pictures the affection and relationship that we had. If you could put yourself, if you were alive back in the time of the 1980s when the culture war started and artists were being blamed for the societal ills, it was great to appear at the shelter. The doors would open on the elevator and I'd hear, "The artists are here. Thank you so much for watching, for listening." And I'd love your questions.
Hope, thank you so much. I learned so much about you today and your art. Everybody give Hope Sandrow a Zoom round of applause.
Thank you. Well, the project was the most amazing experience. Really just, it changed my life, and I can't stop that process of making art with the public and collectively with my colleagues and for myself. That's why I showed you the work I make now. And it follows a path from that time, which I truly attribute to my grandparents, because that's how they lived their lives. And I was very close with them, which Minna can attest to. She's here.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, so Minna and I were brought up, and my other cousins. And I thank Morris and Pearl. Minna knows how much I love them.
Yes, they were my uncle and aunt. But I have a question.
Yeah.
Were you able to track any of the women who left the shelter who had been influenced by your project and what it did for them?
Is that Mina?
Minna.
Minna, yeah.
Yeah.
My cousin, yeah.
Yes.
Minna, for the show, we tried to track down all the women. I was 40 and they were 60 and 70, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And we did find that most of them that were in our project had good lives after that. Theo, whose portrait you saw in that figure, was living in housing at 42nd Street for the last 30 years. And we were so excited for her to appear at the opening, but she died this past summer. And we found that the curators were amazing in their commitment to track down the women. All of them seemed to have died. And I just want to add that not one of them, to dispel more stereotypes, not one of them ever asked me for money or for help. It was basically, we met, we made art, we discussed issues, we were engaged. It blew us, the artists and myself were blown away by the experience of being with them. Oh, yeah, that was my 30 minutes. And oops, sorry. And it was the most amazing, it was a life-changing experience. And one of my patrons, Adriana Mnuchin, said when we first walked into the building, the shelter the first time, she donated the first money to the project, said, "There, but for the grace of God go I." And sincerely, that was true. There were women from all backgrounds there. 99% of them had been raped and abused. And that's why they were finding shelter there. And I'll take another second to tell you that most of you probably knew Holly Solomon. and she came for a tour. And as we were walking around the beds, she looked at one woman and said, "Anita, what are you doing here?" It was her cousin.
Oh.
Anita was an accountant, and Anita said, "Holly, I was raped by our uncle. I couldn't ask the family for help." And so we discovered that that was pretty much the cause of the women finding shelter at the 68th Street Armory, and they're still there. The shelter's been privatized. It's run by Lenox Hill Association.
I
So
wanted
until-
to ask,
Yeah.
Is
I was
it-
just- until
is the art continuing as a therapy for them, like with music in the background, and that they pick up the skills and can work as they see led, or as taking what you've taught them and having the freedom and the materials to do art therapy when they want? Did you sow seeds for them to do that?
I hope so. Carla, the project in that shelter ended in 1906. And so there are projects there now because Lenox Hill runs the project, but I'm not part of it.
Thank you.
It's very different to go into a shelter now with privacy issues than it was in 1990 when I went in there first. Although they were very careful then, and I had to attest to every artist that came in to make sure they respected the privacy, because some of them had husbands outside wanting to kill them. I mean, that was a big problem, or kill their children. Now, the art education project, in answer to your question, that was designed, I designed that so that when they left the shelter, they could teach art in their communities.
Any other questions?
Well, if you were to do a project like that again, would most of the women be there because of drug problems?
It's possible, but I think it's still going to be violence, domestic violence that they're suffering, because that would be the reason to seek private, shelter and be shielded from the outside. At the time I had the project, Fordham had therapists that were on site and treated the women for mental health issues. And they're the ones that told me that 98% of the women in the shelter has suffered violence, rape or assault or intimate partnership problems, and that's why they were there. So from what I read and I follow the issue, I don't think that's changed. And some of the other problems, like not having jobs, or there's also ageism, not being able to get a job. All these issues remain. I don't think they've changed that much, sadly.
We do have on Long Island the retreat, and that is a home, basically a shelter for women who are have been domestically abused.
Yes.
And I've gone into the retreat to do drip painting workshops, and what I noticed when I went in there, as a somewhat naive person, is that the women are literally from every walk of life.
Yeah.
It's every walk of life, issues of domestic violence, issues of homelessness, even issues of alcoholism, and all of these ills. It doesn't really matter what you look like. It doesn't matter, anybody can wind up in one of these shelters given the circumstances, right? It's very humbling.
Yeah.
And the position, I was so moved by the really difficult position women are in when they're in a shelter with children, right? It's hard enough
Yes.
if you're not in a shelter to have children, to raise kids. I'm wondering, Hope, did you have any experiences, like any preconceived ideas as a young woman and then you go into the shelters. Was there anything that moved you that you learned that was surprising or different than what you expected? Or just something, your own personal growth from the experience?
Well, I was living, Ulf and I were living on off Union Square. And as you might all recall, in the 90s, there was an epidemic of homelessness there. And in the East Village, I was showing in the East Village, also in Gracie Mansion Gallery. So I was walking those areas. And I learned that the people that were on the street were quite a different group than the people seeking shelter from the city. And yeah, so on the street, there were more people that seemed to have drug problems. In fact, there was a methadone clinic by Union Square. And so they gathered there. And it really was the inspiration for me to go into the shelter, was to find what is the importance of art to people who have lost everything. And that were, I think the people in the shelter would never, from what they said, would never go on the street. It was a totally different population. I never read any articles in the papers that delineated those differences. I tried very hard to get coverage by journalists, by ones that I respected in the New York Times. None of them were interested in writing about the situation in the shelters and explaining to people what the differences were and what was needed. And I felt really discouraged by that. I stopped reading some of those opinion writers.
Well, that's what struck me when I went to the exhibition, that it was so unusual that this population, so to speak, was made visible through this exhibition that's currently up at the New York Historical Society. It made me realize the degree to which, let's say in general, the homeless population is not represented. And if they are, usually it would focus more on the men for some reason.
Yeah.
That's been my experience. Maybe somebody else has a different experience.
No, that was my experience for those years I ran the project. Was constantly trying to get people to highlight the issues. And that's why why the art is important. And even though the women aren't alive, what they thought and what they experienced is through their artworks. And we all need to listen if we're going to solve these problems, because after this pandemic, it's already clear that homelessness is on the rise for various reasons. And the history will repeat itself of people losing everything they have for various reasons. We know that violence against women has increased, illness. So I'm really grateful for Laura and Rebecca following through on this exhibition, which was postponed for 2 years because of the pandemic. And it comes at a timely moment for people to look and listen again.
Any other questions or comments for Hope? Anyone want to share other thoughts on the subject of how art can impact change? Maybe other experiences you've had or projects that you think are worthy to highlight? We just had a note from Nama Sandrow. She said, "I'm so proud to be your cousin."
I feel the same about her.
Me too.
And Sally
Amen.
Applebaum says, "Inspiring, impressive, what a wonderful project." Mary O'Brien says, "That's amazing. Thank you, Hope." No surprise, your name is Hope. I added that part. Monica Janik said, "Thank you, Hope." And Elka Rifkin says, "That was wonderful, Hope."
Thank you. Well, it's really ironic about my name. It's because my parents wanted to name me a name after H, and they didn't like someone named Helen. And then they didn't like Henrietta, so I ended up with Hope. It's just one of those things.
No surprise. So Sally Applebaum has a question. Go ahead, Sally.
Hi, Sally. Oh, you're muted.
Can you unmute, Sally?
Sorry. Okay.
Great to see you, Sally.
It's been too long.
Yes.
But I guess you know, I really admire your work, and I did want to mention that there's a project in my neighborhood. You're absolutely right. Homelessness is on the rise. There are people. Someone's been living in the bus shelter on my block for several months. A woman. There's all these women living in boxes and tarps and things. But I participate with an amazing artist-run project. It's called Art in Odd Places. And the odd place is 14th Street in Manhattan. And it's aptly named. And there started to be corridors of drug, little flea, they call them flea markets, but they're just drug markets along First and A, et cetera. And I participated in one project, and you sort of feel, I was feeling very uncomfortable taking art out to the street because it's just not there in this neighborhood. There's not art. And one of the homeless people came up to me and said, this gentleman said, we need more art. And just, again, it seems like a luxury. It seems like, how can you think about art and everything? But people are hungry for being acknowledged, interacting, expressing themselves. And so you're a pioneer, and it's absolutely timely again.
That's exactly my experience. And when I first went into the family shelter, I was kind of scared and thinking, I'm so naive. But as soon as I had that experience with the children and the women, they were like sponges, just soaking up everything that was said and done. And we learned so much that it still is inside of me today. And I can picture the different women, and just like you said, this gentleman, that it reconfirms what our life stories are, our life paths, right, Sally? That we're artists, and it's not irrelevant. Times have changed, but it's still an important means of self-representation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I
Thank
see,
you, Hope.
and Rebecca Clausen puts in the chat here, for more information on homelessness in New York City, she has the website for the Coalition for the Homeless. She said it's a great source. So thank you.
They're terrific, and I collaborated. I didn't include them, but I did collaborate with them. And every homeless group there was, I tried to get help for the women. We also had reading projects that were led by artists, a yoga class. I brought in lawyers. Those who know me know that I don't need a placard to ask people to participate in what I'm doing. And I really enjoy it when people join in. I think it's richer, and it one of the delights also is I never know where wherever I go, I meet people that volunteered and were at the shelter, and they still remember coming up and making art with the women in the shelter. It's just like, it was life-changing. It's hard to explain how heartfelt it was. Maybe some of the most heartfelt experiences I've had in our society. I'm not advocating for anyone to go over to people on the street and just start talking to them. As I said, it's a very different population than in the shelters. And part of it is that all this population is used to being exploited. So as I said, it took me 6 months of gaining the trust of the women in the shelter to make art with me, and then with the artists that came. And then the next 5 years was fantastic. It just flowed.
I think also, Hope, when my experience is that when someone such as yourself, when you're doing something that's really good, that really genuinely you're motivated to help people, it's like the universe conspires to bring you the right people, and people do want to help. And I think that these are really hard topics to talk about. But I hope that people take away from your example and the way you used your creativity and your energy to help people. Maybe we can come up with creative ways of helping people today, right? Bring it up to
Exactly.
today.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be a professional artist. You don't have to have money. It might be just calling the neighbor down the street who you know is lonely because of COVID. It might be reaching out to that depressed person and saying, hey, how are you today? Sometimes it can just be a small thing, bringing someone food, or donating art to a good cause, right? A lot of artists do that. So there's so many.
Well, I'm giving my hens eggs to the food pantry.
And the
And
chick,
I've learned that all the food pantries on the East End don't get fresh eggs to their clients. So it'd be really great if more people that have chickens donate their eggs, but food is really important too.
and you're donating really good quality food, which is amazing.
Yeah.
So,
Well, also I used to give them to the retreat when Minerva was the director.
mhm. Any
Um,
closing thoughts, Hope? Okay, I'll tell you what, I'd like to make a few announcements. First, let's give a big thank you to Hope Sandrow. And I know there's a lot of friends and new people.
Yeah,
Say hello.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
And thank you for taking the time, Hope, and thank you for your contribution. And everybody for coming onto our Zoom. And just a few announcements. We have many different themes and programs all listed on pkhouse.org. So coming up related to Hope's topic, at the end of the month, we do have a Zoom program called Cultivating Community Through Art. We also have guest artist Jody Cuquier coming up, who also coincidentally, Hope, works with shells as a way of responding to grief and sorting out shells. I thought that was really interesting. And we have many programs celebrating Women's History Month and art workshops as well. So we hope that you become our Zoom friends. And again, Hope, thank you so much. I learned so much about your art, and I hope to see you in person soon. And go to the New
Let's
York
dance.
Historical Society if you can. It's a great museum and it's a great exhibit.
Yeah,
It's a beautiful site in New
we
York.
should give an extra shout out to the curators. Few people want to know about homelessness, and mounting an exhibition wasn't easy for them.
Mhm.
And a big thanks to Rebecca and Laura for their determination and for the support of the New York Historic Society for mounting the exhibition. They do. And the Pollock-Krasner House is fantastic and an inspiring place to visit.
Well, thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening or a wonderful day, depending on
Yeah.
where you are. And
Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening, and
stay healthy, stay happy, and keep making art.
yes,
Bye. Bye, Hope.
bye, bye, thank you.
I hope.
Thank you,
you.
John.